Hey everyone, welcome to another Tech Corner. James Azar here, your host and CISO. I've got an awesome episode. Joining me in just a moment is Caiazzo. He's the CISO over at Avertium. I did it with my Italian accent. You guys like that? I love it. All right, Paul will be joining me in just a minute, but before we do that, please make sure to subscribe to our podcast. If you're not subscribed right now, hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell. If you have not also subscribed to our CISO Talk podcast, please make sure to do so. We post daily content, daily. Every single day, there's something out there for you. Go and check that out. Now, let's get into this Tech Corner because I promise you it's going to be epic. It's all around healthcare. It's all around shared responsibility models, and it's one that's going to enlighten you. Here we go, folks. It's game time.
From the CyberHub bunker and studio, you're tuning in to the CyberHub podcast Tech Corner. And now, join me in welcoming your host and CISO, James Azar.
Paul Caiazzo, welcome to the show.
Hey, James. I'm pumped. I want to run through a wall after that introduction, so thanks for having me.
You know, and the guitar just matches your 9-inch nail poster, right? Like the guitar right there.
It's fantastic. Exciting.
So, Paul, before we get started and we kind of dig into what we're here to talk about today, which is really the shared responsibility model that needs to be deployed in healthcare around security, would you mind just giving our audience just a brief kind of intro into your journey, your career, and your current role as a CISO over at Avertium?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do it. So I've been in the information security industry for about 23, 24 years. So pretty much since it's been a thing. Started doing systems engineering, had the fortune to be able to operate in some pretty interesting programs for the DoD, doing some foreign military stuff in the Middle East. I ultimately wanted to get out of the business of traveling constantly, so ended up coming back stateside, and I'm in just outside of DC, and started the company in 2008. Called TrueShield, which was acquired by Sunstone Partners, a private equity firm in Silicon Valley in 2018, and merged with a couple of other firms to create Avertium. So I'm still here leading internal security and compliance, but also looking at new ways to solve existing problems or maybe new problems that we can solve for our customers. So it's exciting. I consider myself to be sort of the CISO of last resort for all of the customers that we help, including a lot of healthcare organizations. So the topic today is pretty near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, absolutely love it. So, folks, you don't know, you can meet Avertium at Cyber Week, Georgia from September 20th to the 24th. You'll see more about that in the show notes, so go and check it out. It's going to be a fantastic event. But, Paul, let's talk a little bit about healthcare, right? So the shared responsibility model was introduced to us recently by cloud providers who kind of wanted to create a very simple, we do this, you're supposed to do all of this. Mm-hmm. And that model has now kind of helped break down some of the misconceptions around, the vendor risk management forms that you and I used to get, where it says, do you secure your data? We're on the cloud. And you're like, oh God, it's going to be one of those conversations. Right? The shared responsibility model has significantly reduced that. But now we're looking at that model and seeing how do we take it across the business. And healthcare seems to be a very vulnerable industry. It's also an industry that relies a lot on various different vendors, from IT vendors to IoT vendors to medical machinery vendors to you name it. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as some of the things that healthcare needs to adapt maybe from the shared responsibility model going forward?
Well, I think first off, you hit the nail on the head with respect to the complicated environments that most healthcare organizations operate within. We recently partnered with the American Hospital Association specifically because organizations like that have such significant challenges around securing their infrastructure, securing their patient data, and ultimately supporting the operational need to keep people alive. When you look at a hospital network, there's a wide variety of different types of technologies within those environments. That could be your traditional compute environments that are there to do just typical day-to-day stuff around identity management, or just email and things like that every organization needs. But then the much more sophisticated and more complex technology that's deployed to do various different medical procedures. So all the IoT and things like that need to be managed. Typically, that is being handled by a third party. Most of the time, those are contracted resources that the hospital network or the healthcare organization has bought or contracted with the vendor of that technology to support. And what that means is the attack surface then includes any of those persistent connections to those third parties. And that's something I think a lot of people don't necessarily get right. A lot of organizations focus on their first party risk. How can I manage down risk within my own infrastructure, but are not necessarily thinking about what you inherit from a risk standpoint from your third parties. And so traditional approaches like you described, James, are let's give our vendors a questionnaire and ask them if they've got endpoint protection or if they do patching. And as a guy who has to answer those questionnaires myself, my strategy is always answer with the fewest words I possibly can. Answer honestly and completely, but don't overshare. And so knowing that, if I'm the CISO reading a questionnaire from another vendor, I want to see a little bit more detail. I want to understand a little bit more of the nuance of what it means to say yes to a control question. And so we're looking at ways to use almost sort of adversarial techniques with third-party vendors. And what I mean by that is, we can use intelligence gathering techniques to understand whether or not a vendor is doing the job, be it an open source intelligence gathering exercise against their attack surface, what they present to the internet, or even if we can get a little bit more sophisticated and do some signals intelligence or underground human intelligence of, is this vendor of interest to an attack group that might be executing an operation against them right now? And to me, that is the best way to look at it, because you get the trust but verify that comes out of a motion like that, where you do the job of asking the vendor to tell their story, but then you backstop it with other supporting information that can really lead to a more educated decision as to whether or not they have some risks that you're going to ultimately inherit. So shifting the way that not just hospitals, but certainly healthcare organizations and really organizations at large manage vendor risk, I think has got to happen. And there are great examples of this, even recently relating to supply chain. Kaseya, SolarWinds, those are great examples of what happens when you don't get supply chain risk right.
Yeah, I think the one exception I would say to that rule is that with SolarWinds, the attack was different than Kaseya. I think trying to compare the two to me is a little difficult, and I'll tell you why. Kaseya was a traditional ransomware attack, known vulnerability, kind of deal. SolarWinds was a sophisticated, I'm getting in your CI/CD pipeline, your IDEs, and I'm deploying backdoors into your trusted deployment, which I think is a different sophistication level. Right now, that doesn't dismiss the threat of SolarWinds, but I think SolarWinds as a company didn't deal they were in the unknown. We always thought these types of attacks were possible, but we never thought someone can pull it off, right? So it was always in kind of our, how do you secure your CI/CD pipeline? Well, it's predominantly, most of it is internal. We don't have to worry about it too much. There's very little of it that's outside facing. And then you get a SolarWinds that really reshapes the way you have to look at it.
Yeah, sure. And, it's certainly true that it takes an advanced actor to pull off what happened with SolarWinds. When you look at sort of novel exploits or novel 0 days, things like that, you never see those as part of ransomware attacks. And there's some good reasons why. A 0 day is expensive, and it's not something that you want to burn, without some specific use case. And typically that's the domain of nation state actors that are going to deploy, a 0 day to gain some espionage benefit, and that's their attack objective. Whereas a ransomware operator, their attack objective is get to money as quickly as we can. And that's what, Kaseya was extremely helpful to the bad guys in that regard, in that, just attacking and gaining access to the one company gave them access ultimately to an ecosystem of customers of theirs. And I think that's really the only natural similarity between the two attacks, because you're right, the complexion of them is quite different, and the outcome of them was quite different as well, where with SolarWinds, you had sort of a slow burn that wasn't observed immediately. And took a variety of different directions based upon who was actually on the wrong end of that update. 33,000 companies. I think what I read was the actual secondary attacks were only about 100 companies. So you've got this gigantic universe of companies, but they had some very specific objectives and very specific targets. Whereas Kaseya, let's just ransom as many companies as we can as quickly as we can, and that was a great way to go about doing it.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things when we look at healthcare, organizations. So, we start with the C word, 18 months ago, right? So now healthcare becomes essentially the most critical public service out there, right?
Sure.
We need to support healthcare. And there was a lot of things that were brought into healthcare really with, we got to do this now. We don't have time to really plan for it and strategize for it. Now that things are, I guess we can say, kind of getting into a sense of normalcy, how do you start to go back and kind of repair those, kind of, I don't want to say open vulnerabilities, but really quick plugins in order to save lives, because that was a greater priority than maybe addressing the security risk of it at the moment?
Yeah, sure. The healthcare industry obviously had just an extremely challenging year for any number of reasons, probably least of which is technology. But interestingly enough, I had a conversation earlier today with a large healthcare provider, and they're looking at ways to restructure their security operation around that shared services model that you described. So they're maybe a 6,000-7,000 person organization and about 100 people within the security program, which is a pretty good size. You can accomplish a lot with 100 people if they're well organized and you've got process that's sort of set up for their success. What I heard from them, though, is that they're struggling from a prioritization standpoint of what to work on next. So due to the backlog of projects that, a lot of, COVID created a lot of that backlog, they've got just a tremendous amount of work that would yield some internal efficiencies to the security organization, but they've also got competing pressures from all the external functions of the rest of the business asking security to do certain things. And what, again, I heard from them is that typically they're prioritizing the stuff that comes from outside security versus the things that security actually needs to be either more efficient or better or forward-leaning. So we talked about how to restructure that organization a little bit, but really at the end of the day, the org structure is less important than the process execution and making sure that each of those members of that shared service model know how to interact with their counterparts that are doing some other function, and that there are milestones and checkpoints along the way. And that might sound like, the basics, but at the end of the day, process is really important in what we do, and especially in a large organization that's trying to keep people alive. Having a structured process you can track and make sure it's actually achieving the outcome that you want, course correcting where it isn't is very, very helpful. So that's, I think, one area that people could focus. And another area that we discussed with that specific group, and it's probably applicable more broadly, is the notion of microservices. So rather than have these big towers of, threat detection, identity management is one tower, GRC is another tower that does everything GRC. Maybe there's a way to carve that up into a microservices approach, which is very similar to what we've seen other service organizations do with containerization and things like that. It yields a little bit more agility, in my opinion, where a tag team or a Tiger team can work on some specific thing, own it from end to end, cradle to grave, and deliver a service and is accountable to it. That has been successful, in my opinion, because generally, the alternative is you've got accountability that's shared across multiple resources, and if everybody's accountable for it, nobody is. If everybody owns a process, nobody owns it. So that's a problem that they're struggling with. I think that's one thing also most organizations could do.
I'm having issues with my mute button right now. So you bring the kind of shared services model when it comes to larger healthcare, and that's one aspect to look at it. Mm-hmm. But then the other side of it is also the compliance piece, right? And the compliance piece really does hinder some of the security work that people try to do simply because of the rather different requirements between high trust and HIPAA. How do you start to really get that compliance in order in a shared responsibility or shared services model?
Yeah, you raise a good point, because compliance, assurance, GRC, things like that, they often work in somewhat competition with the more advanced tech groups that are trying to accomplish some operational goal. And ultimately, this is my opinion, probably the opinion of many security professionals as well. But if you get security right, chances are pretty darn good that you're going to be compliant. But if you get compliance right, there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship between that and being secure. We've seen a lot of compliant organizations have major data breaches, largely because those organizations tend to myopically focus on compliance, and compliance is the end state. And I really disagree with that. I think security's got to be in the front and center, with compliance being a byproduct of it. So in a shared services model, that becomes even more complicated, because you've got a variety of different customer organizations, whether they're internal to that hospital network or external to it. Maybe it's a vendor, Maybe it's the the support structure that is around insurance or payers, providers, et cetera. But there are requirements for security across each of those that have to be served. Then those are operational needs that must be served. Of course, compliance is going to want to make sure that you're checking all the box, all the controls are in place, which can slow things down. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to be thoughtful about the actions we're taking and the decisions that we're making. But in a high velocity organization that's trying to accomplish a lot, people are chopping a lot of wood and they want to be able to move quickly. And I found, in my own career that generally the more forward thinking security professionals that are the most agile, the team members that they're the A plus players that you're the one on your team, they can be stymied by an overly focused compliance effort that's really asking them to slow down when they really just want to accelerate. So there's some balance point between them. It's got to be achieved. Some of that's going to be based upon the risk appetite of the organization, ultimately what they're trying to accomplish, how bleeding edge they want to be. And maybe that's a bad analogy to use in a hospital sort of conversation. But at the end of the day, if you're at the bleeding edge, you tend to get bloody. So many organizations don't want to be, quite that far advanced. But again, that pressure between, being compliant and being, responsive, timely, and agile can be challenging.
Yeah, and now we're getting to the ultimate right challenge that comes with healthcare organizations is you kind of have a very robust supply chain. Also, the hospital operates, and healthcare facilities in general operate almost entirely on supply chain, right? It's almost everything from labs to medications to patient files to so much of those different things that go on there, that I find it fascinating that we sometimes can't. What's the word I'm looking for? We can't really align all of the security controls we need because of the different requirements within the operational side of a healthcare facility. Now, in your work, you're obviously exposed to a lot of different clients. How does operational healthcare start to blend into, security?
I think there's a couple of ways. First off, with respect to the supply chain that you described, I was actually surprised to learn that there are, I think, a handful, six or a half dozen or thereabouts, organizations that are called GPOs, and not group policy object, but general purchasing organization, which supply like 90% of the U.S. hospitals of all the supplies that they require. So if I'm a bad guy that wants to disrupt a supply chain, there's a right target. And I think that concentration of supply chain risk scares me a little bit. So it's something I think the healthcare industry should probably look at in terms of diversifying the supply chain. Whenever you diversify, you have the opportunity to draw any individual risk element down, and that concentration of risk can be real problematic if something does happen. So that's, I think, one thing. But in terms of the operational elements of it, some of this, again, is going to be a little bit basic to a security professional, but traditional compute, we understand. We know how to manage and monitor and draw down risk in traditional computing environments. When you start layering on additional technologies, it becomes more and more challenging. So there's the notion of segmentation, which of course everybody should be familiar with. And if you're not, using segmentation, even in a non-healthcare or environment, you're doing yourself a disservice and you're adding additional containment risk if something bad does happen. But certainly in a hospital network, those life-saving and life-supporting medical devices that happen to be networked need to be segmented from the traditional compute. They can't touch the internet. If there's any sort of external connectivity to a vendor, that's got to be very closely scrutinized and locked down as much as you can. Ports and protocols must be whitelisted, block everything else. And even within the organization, right? So there's probably some concept or some function that requires maybe Active Directory integration or something like that. So there's going to need to be some integration between traditional compute and the medical devices, but even that needs to be locked down as much as it possibly can be. So that VLAN, where you've got medical devices running on it, the access control list between it and the compute environment needs to be extremely strict and only allowing the types of traffic that really are necessary. And what I'm really getting to is zero trust, right? So that's maybe a buzzword right now, but the more you implement a zero trust architecture, the better you're going to be at containing risk and managing all the different elements of risk, whether it be a threat actor that's external to the organization, or maybe a malicious insider, or simply just somebody making a mistake. So, the further we can get towards application of zero trust concepts to healthcare industry, I think the better. And specifically because they've got such complex environments that have many different types of computing devices, many different types of operational technology. So I'd start there.
Yeah, I don't disagree with your zero trust characterization. I mean, it's you can give it a different name, but the policy, the idea behind it is very valid in a healthcare facility, right? I remember speaking to people who are in the healthcare industry talking about even the idea of identity access management is complex in a hospital, simply because of some of the rotations that go along with it.
Yeah, sure. And if you think about some of the traditional approaches to identifying anomalous user behavior, you might see someone log in at an odd time. But if you've got rotating shift schedules, an individual may not be logging in at the same time every day. So, that's a detection opportunity that you've sort of lost just simply due to the nature of the business. There are other elements of behavioral detection that can still be applied. For instance, again, if you've done the job of segmentation and you see some user account that maybe is privileged trying to access an environment in a way that it hasn't before, that's a pretty basic anomaly that you can go and investigate, but it'd be worth your while to do so. Or if you see, somebody trying to access a network share that happens to host PHI that hasn't done it before, there's an opportunity for detection as well. So some of the, user behavior anomalies that are, we understand, we've got strategies to detect, those could be applied. They do get more complicated when you start talking about, again, OT environments where you've got technology that's designed to save lives. And I think the hard part is, so if I'm in the middle of an incident, one of the first things I'm going to do, especially, let's say, a ransomware incident, I want to cut off the attacker's access as quickly as I can. So that might mean severing the internet connection. You might kill people if you do that in a hospital. So incident response in a hospital network is completely different, much more challenging. And it's not so much about keeping the operation alive. It's about keeping the people alive. And you have to act differently. And it's an entirely different level of urgency in situations like that.
We talked about kind of like, the complex attack surface of a hospital, right? The hospital is derived of multiple different devices, and these different devices have different activities. Some keep a patient alive, others keep monitoring of that patient, and they're not always the same. In some cases, it's the administration of medicine to someone and nutrients. There's all these different things, and I'm now naming off a few, but I know that you can bring me a list of all these different things. And this creates a complex surface to defend for people like you and I, because there's one of the things that I know about healthcare, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm not a healthcare expert, so I just want to preface by saying that, is you can't really overwhelm the network because the latency is really critical in healthcare. You can't have something have a 3-4 second latency. That could be the difference between life and death for some people. I mean, life and death is a matter of seconds. And so how do you like start to solve to that kind of attack surface that's extremely complex?
Yeah, there's an interesting parallel there, and you're right about the latency aspect of it, and I think that's where I'll draw the parallel to sort of high finance. If you talk to a hedge fund or private equity group that does a lot of high frequency trading, something like that, latency is just completely unacceptable. So being able to do inline inspection like we might want to do in a traditional environment, you can't do. So there are other strategies that you might be able to deploy which buy you some time in the event that you have a bad actor somewhere along a kill chain. And I talked to the CISO of a large hospital network recently. One of the things he's looking at is deception technology to make his attack surface effectively even more complicated, but for the bad guy, right? So to make it more difficult for the bad guy to find something interesting to go and attack through deception techniques. So basically, a deception network that looks right for attack, get the attacker focused on that stuff, and keep the actual compute or, again, life-saving or life-supporting devices out of frame. So if you give the attacker something that's maybe easier to exploit, you're number one going to consume their time, and nobody's got finite or infinite resources, so that time equates to loss of funds for them. It's opportunity cost. But then secondly, you can observe the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're using, and pipe that back into your threat intelligence, pipe it back into your operational monitoring environment, and that gets you some success. So that's one technique. And I think that there's some reason to believe that could be successful, but I think at the end of the day, there's still a deeper problem on trying to draw down all of that, sort of risk surface that you described, that footprint of devices, of technology, needs to be minimized. And that's I think the more challenging thing. To me, though, the most complicated part of hospitals or any healthcare organization's attack surface is the third parties. And I'll just give you a quick anecdote. So recently, we worked a ransom case with a radiology clinic. And that radiology clinic supported doing all the radiological studies for a pretty broad set of hospitals. And that the radiology clinic did not have the proper set of controls, didn't have EDR, didn't have monitoring or anything like that. Got completely crypto locked. And actually, it was one of the faster ransomware cases I've seen, where a bad actor was in the environment for maybe 3.5 hours. They had low-level access through phishing, so that's a basic control. Everybody's got to have something to do or something to stop a phishing attack from being successful. But after that, low-level access was granted. They used print nightmare exploits to escalate privileges, capture domain administrator credentials, and then used a GPO to deploy the ransomware everywhere. 3.5 hours from the moment that bad actor got in, the entire environment was crypto locked. And thank goodness, because if they had spent more time in the environment, they would have seen that there were persistent connections to all those hospitals that the organization works with. So the hospitals on the other side of that, we've been talking to, some of whom are our customers as well, and have, they've asked us, what are we going to do about all these persistent connections? Because we view those as being the most significant area of risk. If we're doing our job correctly at the hospital, but our partner isn't, and they've got persistent connectivity to us, then that opens up a whole new avenue of attack that we really haven't considered. So working on locking that down, they just, frankly, in my opinion, had extremely open connectivity with, just direct routes, no real access controls, just allow IP traffic back and forth. So getting them to think about doing that, differently. Treat your vendors, treat your partners almost like an adversary. And you still have to do business with them, but do it smartly.
So I'll take you with that, because that kind of goes back to your almost trust but verify comment, right? Mm-hmm. Of if using zero trust architecture, but that persistence, that continued connectivity is one, very hard to stop and very hard to control. And again, there's a latency issue to it, right? I had on a few years ago Chris Lindbergh. He's the chief innovation officer over at the CDC. I had him on right before COVID, pre-pandemic. And when we're talking about quantum, actually, one of the funny things is we spent about 50 minutes talking about quantum computing in pandemic data gathering to help prevent a pandemic or a healthcare crisis. I kid you not. If you want to listen to one of the episodes that still makes my hair stand up on the back of the neck, it's that one. One, because the stuff we were talking about was pre anyone knowing what is COVID. Sure. But we talked about that persistence because in healthcare, there are always different stakeholders that get access to data and need real-time access to data. CDC being one of them, HHS being another. I've spent time at the HHS operations center over in DC a few times, and the work that they do there is just mind-boggling. The stuff that they did to block WannaCry was incredible over at that operations center. But that's one aspect of it, right? That's kind of like the government reporting. That's we've got cases that we've got to report in live to specific people. Sure. Then you've also got the billing side to the insurance companies. You've got the different departments within a hospital that need to know all these different information, and the flow of information is really just it's almost like the London subway system, right? Like once you start to look at the New York or London underground system, it's really complex. It's very intricate, and that does exist in healthcare. Is there a way to simplify it, or are we pretty much stuck with this intricate system and having to secure it over a period of time? And then that brings me to my final question here. Doesn't that all mean that shared responsibility model that we started to talk about really doesn't just go between healthcare facility X and vendor Y, but it really goes all the way across the entire supply chain?
Yeah, that's, I think, a really good point. And you're right. The scale of information sharing is really, it's colossal. You hit on a couple of them, but there's even more, organizations within the universe of healthcare that need that data. Some need it for, data analytics to, build better products, build a better mousetrap. Others need it to track a pandemic, to your point. but there's sensitivity to all of that data. So, hopefully there's some layers of abstraction or anonymization which happens. But, like let's say contact tracing, you can't do that, right? You need to know the individual. You need to know, when they were infected, when they, who they interacted with, and that kind of sensitive data needs to be protected at the level of diligence that it really requires. So, maybe one notion could be a information exchange. So an organization that's set up specifically to do data exchanges between these different parties that require that set of data. Again, there's some concentration risk there. If there's one of these organizations that acts as the exchange, even if it's a government body, I think that creates a situation where that's a really interesting attack or target that I might want to go after. But that could be a way to maybe, the centralization of that data moving around could help simplify some of the attack surface stuff that we talked about while still allowing the businesses to operate. That might be one way to do it. But I don't see a future where health organizations are not needing to consume, sensitive data like that, needing to share sensitive data like that. So, the solution's got to be something that supports that motion. Because if we were to tell an insurance provider that, we're going to pull back some of the information that helps them make actuarial decisions on which risks to underwrite or how to structure premiums based upon, statistics that they learn through observation of data, that's a non-starter. Yeah. So some solution that supports what the business currently needs, and maybe there's some ways to think about doing it differently.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point. I can keep going, but we're almost out of time. Time flies when you're having a fun conversation, right? Like I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, seriously, we got here already? Like it feels like we just started. But we are towards the end. Paul, what's some of the ways people can stay in touch with you if they've got questions or want to engage? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, yeah. So for me, best way is LinkedIn. I'm happy to connect with anybody that's interested in security. We publish quite a lot of content on our LinkedIn profile. So Avertium's got its own page. I also publish my own content. So if there's somebody that wants to interact with me based on an article I wrote, love to hear from you. I'm always trying to improve that. So that's probably the best way to do it. You can also just come to our website and see what it is that we do. But if you're interested in engaging in content, be it threat detection and incident response type content or attack surface management or zero trust, whatever it is, we do quite a bit of development around that stuff. So that'd be a great place. So please reach out.
Folks, Paul with Avertium, make sure to check it out. Also, you'll see Avertium at Cyber Week Georgia from September 21st to the 24th, right here in Atlanta, Georgia, in Peachtree Corners. A partnership between CyberHub Summit and Atlanta Tech Park. You can go and check that out. Go to cyberweekgeorgia.com, cyberweekgeorgia.com. You can see more information in the show notes as well there. And also a link to Paul's LinkedIn profile will be there as well. So you can all connect him and bug him as much as humanly possible. Until next time, folks, with another awesome Tech Corner, have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening. Paul, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
And stay cyber safe, everyone. Cheers.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.